Hello, this is David McMillan, former smuggler and survivor, and in prison, when it became too much, escapist. And I've seen the very worst of humanity over 40 years. So I hope I have the experience to perhaps direct to a new vision. Nothing spectacular, but it could be just a greater observation of those things around you. But first tonight, let's hear from somebody you can really trust, not me.
Hello. In the traditional motion picture story, the villains are usually defeated. The ending is a happy one. I can make no such promise for the picture you're about to watch.
Have you lived a long or a short life? But in either case, you're tired of who you are. You want to be someone else. You might have to be someone else. But where do you begin? You'll need papers, you'll need money. But how do you do it, and where do you go? Sit back, and I'll tell you. Hi there. This is part of the Gran Canaria Islands, a lesser island. It's Lanzarote, an island where English people come to die. And around me, they're doing that in droves, even though they seem to keep moving. That was an introduction I perhaps shouldn't use today in the era of Covid-19. But then again, who are we if we can't do what we want? So, I took the trouble when looking at the idea of identity to reacquaint myself with travel, islands, and moving about. And, well, you'll see where I ended up. Well, this is the artificially arranged, what is it, flora of the volcanic island. And, what? Just a minute. That's something worth taking a look at. Wow. This creature reminds me of myself. It seriously doesn't want to be fucked with for the first couple of hours in the morning. Do you, little one? Hey, aren't you? Oh, Jesus. Right. Well, is there anything else around here? You might wonder why I've chosen this kind of introduction to places you can disappear to, when you hear all the time of English scoundrels being arrested and snapped up were in the Spanish islands. But the reason they do so is because they get on Facebook and tell everybody where they are. In fact, in a crowd is often the best place to hide. And certainly amongst this lot, you only have to look a bit of a wreck and you blend right in. Nobody thinks anything of me being here. The most important things is to establish an identity, not one of papers and documents, but one of personality. And the idea is to have no personality. Look at the people around you. They slouch to the pool, they grumble, they fart, they collapse. Okay, you don't have to go that far, but you should look the part. Look like a German tourist. Get those shorts out. Have your suntan uneven. Look lost. Look past caring. If you rent a place out in the hills, you'll have neighbours, and those neighbours will want to know who you are. But if you're down on the beachfront, nobody really cares. In fact, they spend their time avoiding speaking to people. There's a huge gulf between the young and the old, and the young think, well, you're virtually dead anyway. So, if you're over 30 years old, nobody under 20 will pay any attention to you. In fact, you don't exist. Choosing a new identity, pick one that people aren't entirely familiar with. Become Canadian, or something of an outsider, even within the expat community. But then again, English is good because there's so many different kinds, and so many just not worth talking to. You can blend right in. Some people think that travel is not worth it, but when I came here to Lanzarote and saw the mini golf course, I thought, Well, hell, you just couldn't do better than that, could you? Wow, is that a hole? I've noticed many people, when they ask me for a new identity, they get furnished with documentation, they imagine private planes, private boats, and that isn't necessarily the way to go. Usually they don't even consider the pile of documents they've been handed. Now, about the only person who has got away with using private transport was an extremely rich fellow who was I think he was a director for Nissan, was it? And he was in Japan under arrest there. He didn't like to be. He was released on house arrest. I think his name was Goen. I'll think of it in a minute. But he had a very fine wife who went to no end of trouble to get him returned to his native land of Lebanon. My hat goes off to him. But that's about the only example of a private jet that I know of in recent times where getting away really worked. No, what I say here is really true. So, as the first afternoon drew to a close on the island, I sat down and laid out something about identities. And in essence, it came about because I'd been asked to think about the job in the first place by somebody else. Somebody who was searching for somebody. A reporter, of course. A few weeks ago, somebody from the BBC asked me about people who disappeared. He was doing a story, a podcast on, what was it, Kevin Parnell, I think his name was. Anyway, some guy who was wanted for a couple of murders, who disappeared over a decade ago, and was now popping up, if it was him, on social media, taunting the policeman in charge of the investigation. It reminded me of the last time I was asked by anybody in an investigative capacity about people who disappeared, and that was in Karachi a long time ago, when the hunt was on for Osama bin Laden. At that time, the only real idea I had was to rely on the standards of disappearing, not being found. Where was Osama bin Laden? Well, of course, the idea, the most popular idea, was that he was hiding somewhere in the rocks and the caves in Afghanistan, or just along the Pakistan border through Waziristan. Yes, but if I was in his shoes, and those are particular slippers I wouldn't want to be in, I wouldn't have gone for that. I always think, be in some place where there are lots of people. You're much less likely to be noticed. And the towns that sprang to mind around Pakistan were Faisalabad, which used to be called Lyallpur at one stage, after Lord Lyall, and then changed its name to please the Saudis. And then another town that always struck me, it was called Abbottabad. Now, I didn't think of that because I knew anything, but I did know this much. It was a very controlled town. It still is. It's a military cantonment, so mostly there's officers and staff belonging to the Pakistan Army. Very controlled streets in the sense that there's not barricades. There doesn't need to be. It's full of army people. They're neatly manicured lawns and little bungalow houses in relatively wide streets. And I guess the name Abbottabad comes from an Englishman, somebody Abbott. I'll check that later. But that's about as far as I got. It was of no concern of mine. And that brings us to today's little discussion, or thinking aloud, about disappearing, getting new identities and not being found. And as I speak, I'm in the Atlantic Ocean. Well, a volcanic outcrop of that, the Canary Islands. And people often imagine that when they disappear, they think of an island somewhere sunny, as a good place to go. Well, I'd argue that that's exactly not the place to go, because there are not many ways off and on, and certainly, though they're relaxed, they're very easy to look at, with the same small town faces watching, small town faces that notice things. So I think we're going to strike islands off. Before we go on to the art, the mechanics of disappearing safely, let's just ask ourselves the basic things. Who are you? And why are you going? And let's try the why. Let's see. Are you wanted for a crime? The odds are against that. Probably, well, 1 in 600 if you're seriously thinking of disappearing. Then there's running away from a failed marriage. That's much more common. It's quite unnecessary, but people do it all the time. They imagine a different life. In fact, they just want to step out of their own personality. And in that, you first have to assess, what is your personality? What do you do? How do you spend your time? What I mean is, how do others see you? They see you at work, at play, such as it might be, and the trail that you leave. And these days, that's a massive trail on Facebook, on your clicks on Google, and your transactions, which are all monitored for commercial reasons. And of course our governments step in to take advantage of that. Oh, sure, when you're applying for some document, passport or pretty much anything, they'll want to see a bit of plastic, a bit of paper that matches something they already have on their database. But the reality is, if you don't have a Facebook existence or a Google presence, you might as well not exist. So remember, that's who you are before we begin leaving that person. When it comes to disappearing, you have to imagine the person that people think you are and the trail that you leave and the footprint that you have. What happens to that? So really, the first step in a way is to decide how it is that you disappeared, what happened to you, and leave the appropriate clues as to what might that have been, where you went. So you can start sowing the seeds. And let's not forget how others see you, because when it comes to identity, we imagine ourselves as one kind of person, but how do others see us? Probably something quite different. You can begin by telling people that you've had job offers in Saudi Arabia, you've been thinking of emigrating to Canada or Australia, or that you've got a secret girlfriend or boyfriend, something that would kind of explain to people who are wondering whatever happened to Joe, where he's gone. That's just about as important as your new identity, so that when you've gone, there's plenty of people around who volunteer themselves as experts in what happened to Joe. Don't worry about too many blank spots in all of this. Those experts will certainly fill those in and add a bit of colour. So that doesn't have to be too intense, that part, but leave a bit of a trail. Leave hints on social media that you've been searching areas for property, real estate in other countries. Almost everything to do with that. Travel, bookings, real estate. That's important. And perhaps there you lay the false clue that you're going isolated. Look up mountain cabins and retreats, or jobs across the border from the United States. Down Mexico way. That's a favorite spot, isn't it? But that's the false clue. Now let's get to the more important part, who you want to become. As you find yourself with some time on your hands and thinking about who you are, you might start to think about who you might want to become once the great lockdown is gone, once the threat of death from viruses has receded into the background. This may be soon or probably later, or probably, in fact, it's passed you by. But nonetheless, you might have time to think about it. Now, why would you want to leave the identity you have? You're a law-abiding citizen. Surely nothing will happen. Surely nothing will disturb the peace of your life. Or could it? There are quite, well, as innocent as anybody gets, people who might find that their business partner, who in the course of having an affair with their wife has somehow cleaned out the company accounts and made it look like you were responsible. You've considered the options. Even your lawyer tells you to get out of town, but it doesn't furnish the means. Or you're just tired of your own existence and want to walk into a new life. Still, that's not necessarily so easy to do without imagining who you'll become when you are this new person. But let's go to the basics. You should start to think about who it is that might be following you. Now, in that list of reasons for disappearing, which I put at the top, just somebody who wants a new life, or a failed relationship, or the divorce that you simply can't do but the new girlfriend is pushing for. Those are the more likely ones, but let's go to the extreme, where you're likely to be wanted for something, and that's where professional seekers step in. They come in two kinds, police and private. Now, if you've had a failed business and somebody's chasing you for that, that $500,000 that was supposed to go into Portuguese property but never quite made it, ended up somewhere else. Well, they look only as long as the money lasts, and that really applies to police too. They don't really get funded for chasing people. They might get a few days on it to look in the usual places, tap the usual phones, and they'll be looking at the person who's disappeared, contacting his or her old friends, and particularly family. That's the easy way to do it. Once that dries up, if it does, after a few days, there's no really heavy funding for police money in it, unless you're a terrorist or something. And then if you're going to go around blowing places up, I think you should do a lot of planning beforehand. They don't seem to. They mostly plan for their own deaths, which is the ultimate disappearance, isn't it? The sun has set here on the island, but I'll go on. If you need to disappear, you should have planned ahead, or if you're intending to, you'll want to do so. And I guess if you're in the kind of lifestyle or business that means you could suddenly get a word and then need to disappear in an instant, then that preparation is needed. When I was working, traveling around the world, up to no good, I would keep a second set of documents, passport, charge cards, some other papers. They would be in a waterproof plastic bag and taped to the underside of a plastic chair on the deck of a hotel, or on the landing outside if there wasn't one, but somewhere where I could take another direction out and sideways, grab that little parcel of documents, and then hit the road. But how did that come into existence? So the sun set as I was rambling on, and of course the field of documentation, it is a bit of a nightmare. It used to be quite an easy thing, and then the easy thing turned into a too easy thing, and it became a trap. But the essence of this is to think early and act early. And I think it couldn't be more timely, as we might well, in the search for public safety and good health, find ourselves with a compulsory smartphone with an app on it that really knows and reports everything about us. Don't fret too much over that. Well, we know that that information will be lost or ignored or probably misused in some stupid way. But it's around the corner, so let's start in on this thing. Your escape identity should be planned early, as I say, and as we speak, it's still possible to be, say, British and then become a European. I think Portugal currently has the quickest route to that. Once you're a resident for 3 years, you can then apply for Portuguese citizenship. So, what does residence mean? Nothing much. It just means that you register yourself, then 3 years later apply. That doesn't really mean that you have to actually be living there. You could visit for 1 week, set all that up, state yourself as a now resident, and then 3 years down the track you can get that other passport. You can do it the other way round too, and probably with less fuss, by aiming for Irish citizenship. And bear in mind that the Irish are quite generous about who's entitled to their citizenry. I think they still include grandparents, and that's a bit of a hangover from the days when, well, Irish Americans were sentimental about their past, and back in the 70s and 80s, I think, even great-grandparents who were born in Ireland would count towards getting Irish citizenships for Americans. At that time, and probably still today, there were more expat Irish passports around than there were for Irish people living in Ireland. And they cost a couple of hundred, so I guess it wasn't a losing proposition for the Irish government anyway. An alternative is to get the passport of the country in which you already live. If you're British, a British passport, American, another American passport. It's not as easy as it once was. I've described elsewhere using the Day of the Jackal method, that is, finding the records of somebody who died in infancy, perhaps somebody who died of a childhood disease, and poor little thing didn't have any reason to grow up and then have a passport. So you'd know your start place was a birth certificate, which had never attracted any other applications. That sounds pretty straightforward, but it doesn't mean a damn thing these days. Ever since those pesky terrorists started interfering with the drug trade, it certainly caused me a headache and a few borders. Well, it's also tightened up a lot of things regarding passports. Many people had British passports based on the records of people that had died in infancy. They'd travelled for years on those passports, never had a problem. And I spoke to one poor sad fellow who'd returned from Dubai and then even taken the precaution of landing at Paris and taking the ferry over, only to be stopped at Dover, pulled aside, and calmly told that his passport wasn't worth a dime. The reason for this change is that birth records have now been matched with death certificate records. It's taken time, but it's happened. So using the birth records of somebody who's died young won't work anymore. Now, there are ways around that, but I'm not entirely sure this is the place to reveal those. But I'll give you a bit of a clue. Let's see now. All around the world, our citizens travel, and they have children. They have for years. and those children have grown up, citizens of the new country, citizens of perhaps New Zealand, the United States, or another European country. But at some point they realize they're entitled to a British passport. And where would they apply? At the British High Commission or Embassy. Now, there was a time when those embassies issued the passports themselves. They've stopped that and they've centralized it, and it comes back to head office. But bear in mind that layer of documents you then need is not a birth certificate for jolly old England, but for your parents' birth certificates for jolly old England. And yours, well, they can be from pretty much anywhere, as long as the names all match. But of course, that would probably be illegal. Yes, and if that's a hurdle. When I began this discussion, I was talking about identities. That is more than just bits of paper, but the personality that goes with the identity. And I'm asking you to examine yours now and to see what exists of you other than the fact that you're flesh and blood, what your electronic footprint is, what the bits of paper are, and who knows you and who talks about you. So that when we think of becoming somebody else, all of those things must be for somebody else. So, where am I going? Of course, I mean, start the Google account. Start the Facebook page. Now, even those once upon a time 3-second click sets that would create a new email account, yes, that's straightforward enough, but they're pretty good at linking these things up. I remember, because of a legal name change I did, Facebook, despite some changes, like name, managed to link the two accounts together. Not alarmed that I was up to some kind of mischief, but just thinking that perhaps I'd lost my old passwords and had started another one. And, well, anyway, they brought them together. So they're doing that as a kind of a service. But how did they do that? Because I was having the same friends and the same telephone numbers. Oh, and the same date of birth. Now, of course, you wouldn't do any of those things under the new identity. But bear in mind, there's a pattern to things. Now, pattern watching, watching for patterns of behavior, movement, probably choices of things, even choices of shopping. All these go to identity. In fact, the old Bletchley Park code breakers really got onto the mathematics of pattern formation in communications very early on. And before the full ultra decoding, they were getting pretty good information about the German Navy's movements just from the pattern of communications, how often they took place, when they took place. Even though it was in code and they hadn't yet broken the code, just the timing and frequency of it meant something. If this seems like I'm walking out on a limb here, not so much really. I had one identity many years ago before the big computers came in, and I didn't pay the telephone bill on that one. I owed about $500 on it, but it was the least of my concerns. I disappeared and started a new identity. What was his name now? Peter Parker or something like that. Anyway, of course, I had a new telephone at the new place, and because it wasn't an operational identity, that is, I wasn't traveling or smuggling with it, I was just living, I didn't take the usual precautions. So I was still phoning my friends, my family. About 6 months after living at that place, I got a knock on the door, and it was from the lost, dead, vagrant accounts section. And a guy said, Mr. Parker, We think you're responsible for whatever it was, John Smith's telephone bill. Really, I said. And why is that? Well, he pulled out a couple of bits of paper, and they were the records of telephone calls I made now and the calls I'd made when I was John Smith. I looked at them and I was impressed. A pretty good match, I said. Well, I came to some arrangement over that because, well, the old bit of tradecraft comes in. You look around you and you see that he's alone, that he's walking into a street and an address, that he's got a lead but he hasn't any certainty. Does he really want me to pay that $500 telephone bill? Or will $200 and, well, his red pen going through his list do the same job? Red pen, list, 200. So that was the end of that. But it does tell you that matching those sort of records goes on all the time and has been an honoured tradition. So watch for it. Which comes to a very obvious point, but I'll just have to make it. Once you're your new identity, you have to ask yourself, can I call my mother or father or brother? It's not sufficient just to go down to a nearby telephone booth and make that call. For a start, let's up the stakes a bit. You're wanted for not just running out on a marriage or a business gone bad, but you're actually wanted for something bad enough to generate some money should there be a lead. Well, can you contact your family at all? I suppose you can, but you know the strict rules are no, that even your poor old family must be wondering if you're still alive. People very rarely follow that rule because it's got its cruelties involved. In a sense, I can't deny it, it's betraying that family by disappearing. That particular responsibility is abrogated along with the others you're trying to avoid, so well, anyway, it's something that people don't want to do. Some of you might recall, I think it was the US federal warrants that were outstanding. The Marshal's Department simply picked the last known addresses of the people they wanted, and they sent out a notice. Often as not, it was the parental home, mom's address. They sent out a notice saying, well, Johnny Bankrobber, lucky day, you've just won an all-paid vacation 2-week cruise in the Caribbean. You and the other prize winners will be gathering at the Set 'em Up Hotel next Tuesday night. Now, you'd think nobody would respond to that. You'd be wondering if those letters even got passed on. But prize-winning letters seem to get passed on. So on the night of the big prize giveaway, the hotel was picked. I think it was a Hyatt, actually. And there were about 50 or 60, mostly men, and mostly kind of single, in there ready to collect their prize. Now, few of them, just a tiny few, didn't like the look of their fellow prize winners, and they made for the exits, while exits were still open to be made for. Others got the alert by thinking the waiters serving the cocktails and canapé, they seemed to be a bit healthy for your average waiter on low wage, a bit bulked up and a bit ever alert, not so much to their drinks tray, but what everybody else was doing. I think one or two managed to slip away, but soon enough, after they decided, that is the feds, that no more were coming to collect their prize, the bolts were thrown in the ballroom, or wherever it was that the prizes were being given out, and the waiters doffed their jackets, revealed their shiny badges and handcuffs, maybe even waved a gun around or two. But "You're all under arrest" was heard ringing throughout the hall. So, what have we got there? A bit of greed, wanting to collect the prize. Mom's fidelity on passing on that information. But it was an easy roundup, and one you'd think that people fleeing the law would be very well alert to. Let's see. I've won something at my last known address. Point 1. Point 2, I can't collect it remotely. I have to be somewhere in person. The place where I have to collect is lockable. It's a meeting section of a... No, I mean, there were so many clues there, you'd think the place would have been empty. The champagne going flat and the cream cheese going crackly. Nope. And they got quite a few, I think 64. Or is 64 just a number that we all think? But it was quite a few. Now, I've been sitting here with the waves lapping behind me on this island that I'll be leaving very soon. But I've been sitting here talking about past documents and preparing, and 3 years was mentioned in preparation, setting up your Facebook account somewhere else, all based around an identity that you've devised. And by the way, avoid just making a duplication of your current identity. That is, I mean, your current personality. Create your new personality a little like, well, not your dream personality, but like something that's credible. Anyway, I've been talking about all these preparations, and you might be thinking, well, I'm not going to have time for all of this. This could happen suddenly. Or I can't be fussed with all of that. Then your options are getting less and less. What to do? Yes, what to do if you don't have a load of papers at the ready, new identities, passports, banking documents? Well, I suppose it depends how ruthless you can be. You could find yourself somewhere else and talking to an expat and rather admiring his identity. And then you, just as an exercise, look further at what makes him Freddie Fatherman in Pattaya in Thailand. Well, a passport, of course. That's just the start point. Of course, if he's got a lot of local ties, that's one thing. But if he has a close relationship there, that's another complication. But where we're leading is down that path of assuming somebody else's identity. Now, I don't mean so ruthless that you have to throw Freddie straight in the river. But other people have an identity that you can step into. They're not all suitable. Other people have an identity that already exists, and in some cases they're suitable just to step into. But bear in mind a few things. They will go on with their lives, and they'll be doing things. Perhaps they've done things in the past that might not be good. They can catch up with you if you become that person. But you'll have to account for all of that. But it is possible to take their identity, go somewhere else, and then change that identity. So they have a legal name change, especially if they have no intention of returning to their own country. This is a private boat in the harbour, and you'll hear people talking about the advantages of having your own craft, but the reality is it's no advantage whatsoever. You'll be spotted off the shipping lanes within seconds. For private craft, you need special papers, and the captain will come under suspicion, and you don't know who your crew are. Not really. So keep away from that. Go public, not private. The same thing applies to private planes and private jets. They come under heavy scrutiny. They might look romantic in films, but they always come to grief. In fact, the films that are made are always showing you some horror story. And that's what will happen. And of course, you'll remember the last time somebody spoke of a private plane or a private jet, and especially a private yacht. The last words of the report that you'll recall were, "Federal authorities have impounded the craft at the marina." Impounded. That means you'll never see it again. Mix with the crowd, not the private mob. So, you're enjoying yourself there?
Fuck off.
Okay. And the rest of the people here seem to be So, I think we'd got as far as we're going to get with this one, and about time to leave, yes? Done all we can with this identity thing on this island. Remember that the people you fear most, those who work at the airport, they're just doing their job. They're dragging themselves into work, and they're going through a routine. Now, you could spend a bit of time and try and direct yourself to the ones who most feel that way, just going through the procedures, because there'll always be one or two. And I see a few here who take an extra special interest in their job. Did you know that most people who walk away from their own lives and get a new identity pretty much repeat the lives they had before? I don't know whether it's simply trying to repeat that life they had before with different personalities around them, hoping that if they replay it often enough, they'll somehow get it right. There's a pretty good book called, in fact it's called Replay, a bit of a cult classic around, about a DJ he is. He's in San Francisco, has a heart attack at 40-something, comes to and he's 20 again, but he knows everything he did when he was in his 40s. And being a bit of a sports fan, knew the winners in the basketball and the baseball and knew where to place his bets. It didn't work out terribly well for him because he was too young. He won some bets and the mob took it. Yeah, they took it all. But here's the point here. In the story, he keeps having these heart attacks a little earlier and keeps waking up to this restart of his regular life. He wants to replay his own life and get it right. Is that what you'd want to do, or would you want something new? While you've got time to think about it, consider that. Who do you really want to be, and why? Is it because the life you have is unbearable in some way, or just simply dull? And as you start to think who you'd like to be, how would you transform yourself into that person? Don't worry too much about the documentation. Really, if you start to plant the seeds of who you become, that's not too difficult to do. You'll find that you're entitled to the citizenship of another country if you simply live there long enough. And how does anybody know you lived there long enough? Well, they don't. As I've said before, you just enter the country and rent a place and pay a few local taxes, and 2 or 3 years later you've actually returned, and no local officials will know you haven't been there all along. I make this point a couple of times because it's easy to miss, and time is on the march here. Our lives will be soon so controlled in the background that where you were at any particular time will be very easy to check. I'm starting to wonder whether I should have 5 smartphones, all of which have got their own Google and Facebook accounts, and they're all doing their own things. I can suggest this for those who have the need, but I certainly don't. It all seems like terribly much hard work, and I'm too old, and I think a little bit too experienced to have any surprises from people anymore. Well, maybe those people will surprise me yet, but we'll see.